Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us tonight here at Dearborn Public Library. I'm very happy that Mr. Bill Wasik and Miss Monica Murphy will be joining us here tonight to talk about their new book, Our Kindred Creatures: How Americans Came to Feel the Way They Do About Animals. For the format tonight, we'll say we maybe talk for 45 minutes and then have about 5 to 10 minutes of Q&A after that. Just some quick announcements. We have some great programs, virtual programs coming up, and also in person. Next Thursday, we'll have a couple of Michigan notable book author tours, Gassin Zedidine and R.S. Deering, to talk about their books here in person here at the library auditorium at 6:30. And then the week after, we have a couple of great virtual talks, one with Adam Higginbotham about the new Challenger book on Wednesday the 5th at 6:30 p.m. And then on Thursday the 6th at 6:30 p.m., Mr. Will Cockrell will join us to talk about his book, Everest Incorporated, how the guiding industry on Everest developed and blossomed into what it is, a great business now. So want to welcome Mr. Wasik. He's the editorial director of the New York Times Magazine, and Miss Murphy, veterinarian by trade. I want to say welcome. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Well, thanks so much for having us. And welcome from, we're in our living room in Brooklyn, New York, and so glad to be talking to you all today.
Yeah,
so
we'll have it we'll turn it up. So how did, I guess they're always the great place to start with something like this is how did you come up with the idea of this book? Is it kind of a relationship to your previous book about the rabies virus?
Yeah.
It is. Yeah.
Yeah. So Monica's a veterinarian, and I'm a journalist and editor, and we hit on the idea of writing about rabies, sort of as a shared interest. It was a subject that Monica had told me about over the years, and I couldn't believe that nobody had ever written a history of it. And then in the process of writing that book, we just became really, really fascinated with the late 19th century. Monica wrote a chapter in that book that focused on Louis Pasteur and his invention of the rabies vaccine. And the more you sort of read about that era, though, the more you realize that, in the realm of science, in the realm of industry and the economy, population, in societies like Europe and the United States, just a time of just incredible transformation, especially around animals. And so, we revisited that time period and became really interested in sort of all the different changes that were happening in America, basically from the end of the Civil War until around the turn of the 20th century.
Now, there are numerous figures that you point out in the book. Louis Pasteur, one of them. Why don't we talk about that? There was doctors in the late 19th century. They had one view of germs and disease, whereas Pasteur was kind of at the forefront of finding vaccines. Finding vaccines. There was a lot of back and forth about that. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. So during the 19th century, especially in Europe, there was an ongoing discussion about the origins of disease. And there were still plenty of people, including physicians, who believed in theories like the miasma theory, that sort of exposure to unwholesome air might create the conditions for disease to take hold. Whereas others, germ theorists, were proposing that there were as yet sort of unseen or largely unseen microbes causing disease. Louis Pasteur's work provided the evidence to really allow the germ theory to sort of take off relative to the competing theories of the era. It wasn't embraced right away, though. In America, there was still a contingent who believed in alternate theories of disease, including a lot of physicians, whereas veterinarians, because the leading journal that brought sort of scientific thinking to the country's veterinarians was edited by a Frenchman, Dr. Alexandre Liotard, who was a big fan of Pasteur and made sure that Pasteur's work was quickly translated from the French into the English and put in front of veterinarians so that it could inform their practice. And so Louis Pasteur's work was, sort of widely accepted in veterinary medicine, even when it was a little bit less so in human medicine in the United States.
But just so people who are listening kind of understand how all of this fits together in the book, one of the threads that you see, during this time period is you have the beginnings of an activist campaign for animals, and one of the groups of people who they are both allied with but also in tension with is essentially the rise of a kind of more scientific vision of medicine, which happens both for doctors who treat humans, but also for veterinarians as well. And so that you see both a kind of the vets become the allies of people who are trying to make animals' lives better during this time period, but then also you have research happening on animals, which becomes a subject of great controversy then. And so the scientists, the scientists kind of find themselves both simultaneously helping animals, but then they also become, there's a source of tension there with the people who want, for the campaign against animal cruelty to move forward.
Well, there's a lot of back and forth in the book. You talk about how veterinarians, pretty much at a time before, I believe, Leotard started his college in New York, anybody could call themselves veterinarians. And it took, and there's a great chapter about how the horse flu chapter, how veterinarians show their value, because horses was, they moved stuff. They moved mountains pretty much. They moved people. That was the main transit in New York. Then on the other hand, there's also you have a chapter in the book about how there is still a group, many doctors who believed in vivisection, and how in the supposed medical research, medical advancements could be made from that, and how humane societies were against that. So there's a lot of back and forth, a push and pull. It wasn't a straightforward thing.
Yeah, that's right.
So let's see. Now, why don't we talk about certain specific figures in the sense? Henry Burke. He was a kind of sounded like he's a well-off man, but he decided to start a society for prevention of cruelty animals because of moral indignation. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, so Henry Berg was a wealthy man, as you say, and sort of a frivolous one. For a lot of his life, he traveled widely. He wrote plays and other things that weren't particularly well received. And eventually he did do a term as part of the delegation to Russia in the Lincoln administration. So he was, sort of working as he wasn't the ambassador, but he was in the diplomat. In Russia, in the years sort of during the Civil War, at least during the Lincoln presidency. He had a few conversion experiences to animal welfare during his travels. One he talked about that occurred sort of early on in a bullfighting ring in Spain, where he was really disgusted by the sort of cheers of the crowd for the cruelty to the horses and the bulls. Later in Russia, when he witnessed a driver abusing a horse and he successfully intervened to stop him from doing so, he sort of became he was converted to the cause sort of in a more active sense, and he decided to be the one who would start the first Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals in the United States. So he brought that idea back with him when he returned to New York, after stopping in London and sort of learning the tools of the trade from the Royal Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, which preceded the American one by quite a while. And he arrived in New York with activist furor and got his petition circulated, his legislation in Almaty, creating the ASPCA, and passed a welfare law that the ASPCA was tasked to enforce.
Yeah, one of the things I think that's really remarkable about this era is that, these organizations, and the ASPCA was called the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, but it was only effective in New York. It essentially only had jurisdiction in New York. And then other organizations sort of started up on the same model around the country, and they were given essentially law enforcement powers by the states where they operated, which really was a reflection of just how kind of undeveloped law enforcement really was at this time. The police forces were overtaxed. They just didn't really fight crime very effectively, and so the SPCAs were took that authority as sort of as private organizations. So the second major character who we should talk about, who was the founder of the Massachusetts SPCA, was a guy named George Angell. Angel with 2 L's at the end. And he came from a very different background. He was not wealthy. He was the son of a Baptist preacher, and sort of befitting that, he was really the evangelist of the movement. He was really focused on moral uplift. He really focused on children. His society started a publication called Our Dumb Animals, which is sort of a funny sounding name today, but it meant, these animals who can't advocate for themselves, and we need to advocate for them. And this publication was subscribed to by people outside of Massachusetts. And it was, it had fiction and poetry and inspirational essays, and it was really designed to be kind of read around the table by mothers and children, and to instill positive values in children. He started a thing called Bands of Mercy, which was this group of organizations that had started. The idea had come from England, but the notion was kids would start their own clubs that were designed to keep them, on the straight and narrow path when it came to animals and being kind to them. One of the things that he deserves an incredible amount of credit for, that people often don't know, is that he basically created the worldwide success of Black Beauty, which was a British novel that had been published in 1877. But it was in 1890 when George Angell first saw it 13 years later. It had never been published in the United States, and he decided that this novel was going to be a book that would do for the cause of cruelty to horses what the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin had done on the issue of slavery. So he actually just started printing it tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of copies and selling it very cheaply, and printed the Uncle Tom's Cabin of the Horse, as on the cover of it. And that was really what made Black Beauty take off, and suddenly translations were underway into other languages. And it became a better selling book than Uncle Tom's Cabin, and became one of the 19th century's best-selling books. So that's really that's George Angel, who in some ways is kind of the biggest character in our book. He lives a little bit longer than Berg, sort of presides over the growth of the movement for a little bit longer after Berg is gone. And then the third activist character who we really want to mention is a woman named Carolyn Earl White. So Carolyn Earl White was instrumental to founding the Pennsylvania Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. And at the time, in the 1860s, women were not really allowed to be leaders in society. So even though she was really the one who got it going, she had to step aside for male leadership. So then she immediately starts the women's branch of the Pennsylvania SPCA, which then goes on to do a number of remarkable things. And one of them is in 1871, they found the nation's first humane animal shelter. And they, try to feed the animals better. They try to, I think, hold on to them a little longer. They do ultimately euthanize the animals that can't be, reclaimed by their owners or adopted. But they do a bunch of research to try to figure out what a humane method of killing the animals would look like, which at the time was a really big leap forward. I mean, the way that city pounds would it was very barbaric, but get into in the book. But then over time becomes more of a leader. She also founds the American Anti-Vivisection Society, which is advocating against medical research on animals, which is a society that still exists. And she, led that fight for many years as well. And by that time, in the late the 1880s, 1890s, it was more accepted that women would be leaders of organizations in that way.
Wanted to ask about our dumb animals. Was it the articles, was the purpose to sort of anamorphize animals to give people a reason to care about them, I guess is the best way to put it.
Yeah, and I think the way that the publication attempted to do so, I mean, they tried lots of different tacks. I mean, some of them are just very sentimental, sort of more showing what a like nice young boy, holding up some, fictional little boy, treating animals so nicely, and then there's definitely some more first person, sort of more in the style of what Black Beauty would be, sort of dramatizing the animal's experience of being treated kindly or cruelly. And that was another piece of it. And some was nature appreciation. All of it was pretty sentimental. Like it doesn't read super well to contemporary sort of tastes.
Well, it reads like children's literature, even though it wasn't necessarily written just for children. I
think it's a little bit sweet compared to what we sort of consider like interesting
even today. Yeah,
children's literature now.
Yeah, that's true. But yeah, I mean, one of the big themes of the book, to your point, is really about the power of imagination in this movement, right? The idea that part of what was happening with animals was people sort of imagining their way into the perspective of a creature who, whether it's a horse or a beef cow or whatever, that they might otherwise have just sort of thought of as a possession or a tool to be worked or so on. This also comes in around P.T. Barnum and the rise of animals in exhibition, which do you want to talk a little bit about Barnum?
Sure. So I think the reason Barnum comes into our book is because he was so important in the 19th century, a figure in sort of popularizing animal as celebrity and animal as entertainment. And he started out doing so as a owner of a museum, so a really popular fixture in New York that tourists and others would visit, and they would see animals both as sort of taxidermy displays, but also as living creatures in a variety of sort of settings. One of his most spectacular exhibits was actually a pair of beluga whales, which he brought down from the St. Lawrence River. The first whales to be displayed alive in New York City or probably America. The later on, of course, Barnum is still remembered for his circuses, and it was again, animals being sort of the centerpiece of the show he took from city to city around North America. The elephants especially were his pride and joy, sort of, and he made them into stars.
Yeah, I mean, one of the he gave them names, he gave them backstories, he sort of encouraged people to think about them. I mean, he kind of gave them personalities. They weren't people, but he gave them personalities, and in that sense, he was simultaneously somebody who was being very cruel to some of these animals, certainly the whales, and yet he also, in another way, was part of this same kind of movement of reimagining animals, and kind of pushing people to think of them as individual and special and kind of worthy of a level of consideration that they hadn't really gotten before.
Yeah, he was a forerunner in that regard. My wife and I, we keep track on the internet of a couple animal rescue places like Edgar's Mission in Australia and a herd of elephants in South Africa. And you see the personality. You see the personality of the animals, like pigs like home improvement videos. And the elephants, you see the personalities of them. Like one's a caretaker, one's maternal, one's fiery. You see these, you see all these personalities, so you can't help but feel some affection towards them. But Henry Berg kind of had maybe not a questionable relationship, but he kind of looked the other way sometimes, it seems, or at least that's the impression I got from reading the book.
Yeah, I mean, we sometimes describe Henry Berg and P.T. Barnum as frenemies, because they antagonize each other. In fact, they both seem to really relish their public spatting, because I think each felt correctly that it brought attention to their own operation. On the one hand, in some of these arguments, when Henry Berg publicly sort of disagreed with what Barnum was doing, sometimes Barnum was right. I mean, Henry Berg took issue with Barnum feeding whole prey to snakes. It's true that today we realize that feeding live animals to snakes is not necessary, nor is it good for the snakes. Whole prey is necessary for snakes, and Berg insisted that it wasn't. But on the other hand, Berg definitely missed opportunities to take Barnum to task for how he treated his animals, and it is, I guess, by folks who have studied the issue, there's not total agreement on what his motivations were there, whether he thought it was sort of more convenient to keep Barnum as, you know, sort of close, because Barnum was a, you know, wanted to be part of the animal welfare movement on some level. And I think Berg had hopes that that Barnum would, you know, eventually give money to the movement in a major way. I guess I'm probably of the school that thinks it's a little less transactional than that. I think he thought of Barnum more as a useful foil than, you know, money bags. But definitely there was there were missed opportunities where I think if Berg had, you know, taken a stronger stance against some of what was happening in the circuses, there might have been different norms set that we would have inherited into the 20th century and would have been good for animals.
My dad worked for many years at the Detroit Zoo. So I had the great fortune of walking around the site, getting to know all the exhibits and stuff. And I was quite taken by your discussion of William Hornaday, how he and how he came, how do we do the debate about wild animals? Do we want to see them in some kind of reminiscence, or kind of like what they would normally see, and you don't have iron bars preventing them. Can you talk about his background?
Sure. Hornaday he was trained in taxidermy, and he was helped to found the well, he worked in the early iteration of the Smithsonian Museum, and then he also was, you know, working on establishing the National Zoo, and in this vision of a more sort of naturalistic environment for animals to be displayed in, as opposed to the norm at the time, which was iron cages. Like you said, animals were up and close, right where you could see them, but they weren't behaving in anything like what might be considered natural ways. And he ultimately didn't get to see that project through, and he left this, you know, sort of animal display field for several years. I think he worked in real estate or something before he was sort of called back in to help establish the Bronx Zoo. And that did become really the showcase of his ideas about displaying animals in natural settings. And he really, in his choice of a site in a relatively undeveloped part of New York City that had a lot of topography and mature tree cover, and sort of using those natural features in a way that would, you know, sort of put animals in a really lovely perspective, even if they weren't, you know, sort of in full sight always the way that people at the time were accustomed to seeing them. His legacy, of course, is, you know, on that front is, you know, it's still today that what zoos are striving for in terms of creating displays that are both sort of comfortable for animals and allow them to behave in as natural a way as possible, even if that's sometimes sort of at the expense of the viewer experience. Although ultimately, I think we all like to see animals, you know, and as happy as possible. So that's that was a real success for him.
And I was disappointed to find out that the slaughterhouses in Chicago was a tourist attraction.
Yeah, it really is remarkable, because, you know, these were really brutal places, and they, you know, just to step back for a second, I mean, one of the big arcs of our book is, you know, at the beginning of our time period, 1866, you're sort of not that far removed from a country where the meat that you would eat would come from a cow that was, raised very close to you and slaughtered very close to you. It might even have been a cow that you owned, right, back when the country was just like overwhelmingly agricultural. And then over this time period, you then go to a point where they're raising the cattle overwhelmingly in the Midwest and then shipping them by train, and they're being slaughtered close to home, and you purchase the meat. Then you have the rise, soon on the heels of that, you have the rise of the meat packing industry. So essentially the cattle are being raised in the Midwest, slaughtered in the Midwest, and then the meat is being shipped all around the country. And that's made possible by refrigeration technology. And before that, by advances in canning and tinning and so on, and better, but so the upshot of that is you wind up with the development of these just like incredibly large facilities for transporting, storing, and then killing and disassembling animals that are all taking place kind of away from human society. And one of the things that we write a lot about in the book is the way in which that really scrambles and kind of challenges the theory on which a lot of these animal welfare activists were evangelizing for the cause. They sort of had this notion that, you could sort of walk around your city and see people who were mistreating animals, and you could stop them, you could arrest them, and you could sort of improve the whole moral fabric of society by just kind of looking out for the animals around you. But then over the course of these same decades, you have the rise of just this massive industry that raises animals and slaughters them, often very cruelly, where there's this massive distance between the animals whose flesh you're eating and where they lived and died. And then, as you say, the sort of even more vexing thing is that they were a place that tourists wanted to visit, and they seem to be kind of stealing themselves by looking at all this blood and noise and stuff, just stealing themselves sort of to challenging themselves with the kind of the rise of a sort of modern, industrial society and the incredible scale and speed, and blood that was involved in creating it. So yeah, that's in some ways, I think the thing that we put forward as not exactly the greatest failure of these era of animal reformers, but the transformation that during this time period, things really get a lot better for animals, and yet simultaneously for food animals, it's not that they get worse, because individually they are not necessarily treated more cruelly, but the scale of what happens to them just like multiplies exponentially during this time period. And it is one of the really kind of challenging aspects of trying to understand this time period and how we should feel about it.
It almost, or at least I almost took it like it normalizes it. It makes it acceptable, and it just. Yeah, just understanding, because you point out in the book how population grew exponentially during this time. There's a growth of industry, a lot of things happening, and that's sort of and it's all this essential horror you see kind of normalize and makes it acceptable to treat animals that way. But then, yeah, you talk about how it makes it hard for people who evangelicalize to try to treat animals nicely, to think of them as beings with feelings.
Yeah, it's sort of, I mean, another way of putting it is it kind of routinized it, right? It sort of, by turning it into a kind of factory-like process where, what comes out the other side is, the meat that sustains the whole nation. People learn to um, accept it almost as a foregone conclusion of what it meant to live in a society that was increasingly, large and fast and run by machines and growing and so on. And yeah, and I think that we still live today, certainly we still live today in the shadow of that transformation, where it is still the case, even though food animals today are definitely treated better than they were then, it's still the case um, that we're allowed to buy things made of animals without really thinking about what our obligations to those animals are, because of the scale and the distance and the kind of the way that in which that whole world is sort of sequestered from human society.
They people like Mr. Berg and they weren't totally against having bringing cattle to slaughter to eat. They proposed some nice things like cattle cars that treat them nicely. Uh, Horses were when they were moved around. It was suggested by humane societies that they they would have large cars that they would be comfortable in. They weren't active. It didn't seem like activists were totally against it. It's just the cattle were often treated horribly when they were brought to market.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what is it's not sort of super intuitive to us who care about animals today about the activists who started this movement is they cared a lot, not just about the animals themselves and the experience of them being like well cared for versus abused, but they cared about the sort of moral effects of what they called cruelism, of of carrying out or witnessing cruelty to animals. Like they thought that was damaging to human beings. So they didn't simply see animals as deserving of good care. They also thought that people who were cruel were sort of despicable, and that watching someone be cruel was it was bad for you. So and contributed to just sort of a whole moral decay in society.
Yeah, well, I mean, to your that was sort of the normalizing effect, right? The idea that if a child sees somebody beating a horse and that's seen as acceptable, then they might feel like it's acceptable to be cruel, not just to animals, but also to people. And that was a really strong argument during this era. And as as we were just talking about with the rise of this kind of industrialized meat production, it all sort of gets turned on its head, right? Because all of the cruelty disappears from normal human society and is all concentrated in this one place. And based on the arguments that a lot of these reformers made, that might seem like progress, right? But from the perspective of the animals, it's hard to say that it was. And so it definitely really challenged, I think, where the point sort of Monica's making here, it really challenged the kind of basic principles on which some of these reformers really thought about their mission, because it was they thought very much about the communities that they lived in, but they weren't really prepared to think about that you could have animals at this distance who were treated, having to suffer cruelty that few people would witness.
Well, especially at that time, I mean, if something was so far away, you weren't going to pay attention to it. It wasn't going to bother you. It wasn't on your mind because you just didn't think about it. It was hard enough getting meat, hard enough getting along sometimes.
Yeah.
So I, the Westminster Dog Show was on last week, and it brought, and I heard it was like the 148th show, and doing a little addition came right smack dab like 1876, and reading the book, you do have a small mention of the first show about how it was uh, very fashionable to have the best of spaniel, the best of this brand of dog, this breed of dog. Uh, did you run across in your research any mention of like how it was created, or what was the gist of creating the show?
I guess I'm not sure whether I can
Read
speak
about it,
Yeah,
read about
read
it
a
at certain
bit about
points.
it. But I think we were more interested in sort of you know, the ways in which society was like ready for the show. Like they were ready to embrace the idea that breed dogs were special, and you could, you know, tell a lot about a dog based on sort of how he looks, and sort of who his ancestors were in terms of what he would do and be like and how he'd fit into your life. And that they like the idea of, you know, competing dogs and judging dogs, and dogs as sort of like as expressions of your self and lifestyle too, like which dog you owned, like what that says about you.
Well, yeah, and I mean, it's also really there's also just the intersection of dogs and money and right disposable income. I mean, partly I think why you see. I mean, one of the things I think we do write about in the book is how you really start to see the rise of pampered pet keeping, a subject that we're all very familiar with now. And you really see it among the wealthy, I think, because they had the resources and the sort of, inclination to begin to think about these dogs that became kind of fashion items and status symbols to sort of see them as, okay, well, we should make sure that they go to see a doctor, which might have seemed a little shocking at the time, that we should, buy them fancy food and we should buy them fancy clothes. And these are all things that we now are able to do because as a society, we're so much richer, and also, we've now mass produced things that are cheaper and so on. But so you sort of, I think in the book we kind of write about the rise of breed dogs and the rise of the kind of wealthy developing a certain new kind of dog love, because I think it was really their disposable income that allowed them to sort of be the first to think about and treat dogs the way that a lot of us do
Well,
today.
urbanization,
Yeah.
and people were living differently than sort of, further away from other types of animal life, excluding horses, which were of course huge during this time period. But yeah, the, people living in apartments and just for the same reasons we now like to have animals in our lives, when we live in cities. That was very much already happening back then.
Oh, the reason, what makes me ask that is how it was like a sudden realization, is like within like 10 years or 15 years, the attitudes towards dogs changed. With the talk about the shelters, the humane kill shelters, and how they were running around, in reference to the lady who had to get the rabies vaccine. And then all of a sudden it's like they're for show. They're a whole different attitude towards them. And it just sort of like it just is like, wow, that is quite a quick change.
Yeah.
And finally, well, let's do a final question, and kind of very appropriate about pampering. Can you describe the Hartsdale Pet Cemetery? Sound like you visited there.
Yeah, symbolically, one of the reasons we end the chronology of the book in 1896 is that was the founding of the very first pet cemetery, Hartsdale, which is in town of Hartsdale, New York, just north of where we live here in New York City. And Hartsdale was founded as a collaboration between a wealthy woman who had property in that area, and then a veterinarian named Samuel K. Johnson, who we write about a little in the book. And you know, it was seen as a real novelty at the time. But if you go up there, you can still see some of the original late 19th century headstones, and sort of see just how much, you know, the love of pets was enough even then to kind of to begin to see them as members of the family who, you know, deserve a burial and memorial, you know, and of course we now have so many other ways that we memorialize our pets. And you know, it's not as common, it's not that common for, I think, for people to use pet cemeteries, but it still felt symbolic to us, again, of this kind of transformation of dogs and then eventually cats into sort of family members whose passing, you know, really needed to be memorialized and grieved, etc.
Yeah, the pictures are quite striking, and even at that time, the length that people went to memorialize their pets was something else. So, all right, let's move on to the question and answers session. And this gentleman has had his hand up a lot.
You talk in your book about the almost extermination of the buffalo.
Yeah, you talk about the buffalo, the hunts, and how it almost was exterminated.
Yeah, it is during this time period when the buffalo harvesting, which had accelerated, you know, even prior to the period we're writing about, due to a variety of factors, it really became mechanized and scaled up, thanks to the influence of I guess innovations in guns, and the sort of opening up of the West to first steamboats and then railroads, which allowed products made from bison to be shipped out. The support of the government during these years when they were really, treating American Indians terribly, moving them onto smaller and smaller lands and trying to deprive them of their traditional lifestyles. So the bison really do sort of barely make it through this time period. It's Hornaday at the Bronx Zoo is instrumental in rescuing them from the very brink of the last individuals disappearing. The birth of the conservation movement is something we haven't really, talked about yet in this discussion, and it is another one of the threads in our book. We write about not only the sort of the decimation of the bison, and then them being ultimately, after a really close call, being reestablished to a much lesser extent in captivity and then re-released out into the wild. We also write about the early Audubon movement to protect birds, which some extinctions were happening in birds too during this time period of the passenger pigeon and the Carolina parakeet, two very famous cases. And this realization among Americans that human-caused extinction was happening, and that humans should be working to counteract that part of so-called progress.
Yeah, you cover a lot of things like how buffalo were hunting many fancy birds like herons and terns, and were hunted down for feathers and ladies' caps, and how the Audubon first incarnation of the Audubon Society tried to encourage women to say, hey, don't stop buying hats with feathers as a way again to treat animals better, because they were on the verge of extinction, and the people were kind of, or at least the scientists that you mentioned, sort of like, well, okay, they're kind of extinct, going to extinct, but they weren't really. It didn't seem like they were grasping the sense of it. They'd be gone. So, any more questions here in the audience? Yes, ma'am.
Did you say that it was the European activism that sort of started before the American? And I think Europeans are still way ahead of us.
European influence.
Yes, that's right. I mean, you know, it's in the 1820s that London first starts the, you know, what is the world's first SPCA. And then it percolates throughout Europe in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, and comes actually pretty late to the United States. And, you know, one of the things that, I mean, there was a version of the book where we wrote more about what was happening in Europe, but we ultimately didn't write that much about it, in the interest of wanting to show kind of how the arrival of that movement sort of, you know, to the United States winds up intersecting with all of these other transformations during the same time period. You know, it's also reasonable to believe, I think, that that the fact that the movement percolated in Europe for some time made it kind of spread more quickly when it did finally get here. You know, one of the things that we remark on in the book is that it's really in about 10 years, from 1866 to 1876, you have these societies crop up just all over, and they change the laws, they change the norms, and it feels to us, you know, like one of the sort of underappreciated shifts in American society. And I think partly why it did spread so quickly is that you know, some of the kind of habits of mind that had, I think, allowed it to spread in Europe did exist in the US. It was very sort of fertile ground for the spread of this movement when it finally did come.
Okay, let's check online. Yeah, you mentioned the transition. How horses were the mean mode of transportation in New York City for a long time, but then towards the end of the book, you mentioned how the car takes over. Well, one of the latest questions is what happened to all the horses after that?
Well, it's actually, there's a delay. I mean, even though the car had been invented by the sort of close of the time period we write about, and the end of the 19th century, it was not until the second decade of the 20th century that the number of horses on a lot of big city streets, big cities like New York City, but other big cities around North America, those numbers peaked between 1910 and 1920. The year, is it
1912? I thought.
1912. And which is, I think, counterintuitive to a lot of people, you know, that it was many decades after what we think of as the sort of peak of the Industrial Revolution. It was, you know, many years after the steam engine and railroads, and even many years after cars were invented, that we actually start to see declines in the number of horses in North American cities. And since we didn't ultimately do a lot of research into the decades following our period of study, in terms of the story of what happened to those individual horses who started their careers working on city
Well,
streets,
yeah, I mean,
I don't
Oh,
know.
no.
Wasn't good.
Well.
It probably wasn't good. But you know, it is some of those horses would continue to find work, you know, in the decades that followed the peak. I think the milk delivery horse was one of the last to go, because a lot of folks thought that for things like delivering milk from house to house, the horse was indispensable. There's no substitute. They were smart transportation. They could pilot the wagon sort of based on their habits, and they didn't even really, you know, allowing the milk guy to focus on delivering the milk, and not sort of driving and going through his route. So yeah, it's I think it's probably, you know, I don't think a world in which we rely on horses in cities is like good for horses. So I think ultimately this transition is good for those of us who care about animals. But it was it didn't go quite like I maybe thought before I started researching it.
Okay. Anybody else or question? Okay. Well, thank you very much, Ms. Bill and Monica. Appreciate your time. Uh, as a sensitive person, it was sometimes hard to read the book, but it was certainly eye-opening, and really appreciate it. It really points out a lot of great things, and thank you very much. And I want to encourage everyone. We have Trisket outside, the foster dog from the Friends for Metro Detroit Animal Shelter. I hope everyone here could stop by and say hello, and also pick up a copy of Mr. Wasik and Ms. Murphy's book. Thank you very much for your time, and have a good night.
You too. Thanks for having us.